Hey, Chen. Or not. You with us, Chen? All right, good.
Hello, Patrick.
Hey, Orlando, how's it going?
Good, thanks. Good to see you, sir.
Good to see you too.
Thank you.
And we'll give everybody several more minutes to get in. Of course, we're going to start this as close to on time as possible, but we know that people tend to attempt to connect to Zoom meetings a couple minutes late. So we'll go ahead and plan on starting at 7:03. That gives everybody just a few minutes to get in after the top of the hour. And then we'll go ahead and introduce ourselves and our guest speaker, and then start at that point.
Acknowledged.
We have 209 people signed up tonight, so we'll give everybody just a few more minutes to get in, and then we'll go ahead and introduce ourselves and our guest speaker.
Hey, Patrick, this is Nick. I sent you a private chat question.
Yeah, I'm about to reply.
Okay, thanks. Just wanted to make sure you saw it.
All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you everybody for coming tonight. My name is Patrick Botts Forbes. I am the LAFD CERT Central Bureau Coordinator. Joining us tonight is also Chin Tamaseng Si, our South Bureau Coordinator. See, I hope I got the name right.
You got it.
Yeah, I know your name. We actually, LAFD has started up their in-person community emergency response team classes. Starting at the beginning of April, we had the first class in Mid-City go live, and we've had several more classes start taking on signups. So if you're interested in and live in the area and interested in taking the community emergency response team class and you haven't yet, now is an excellent time to sign up and join in. And if you go to the website cert-la.com, and I'll put it in the chat, you can find the link to all the classes there. And these classes are 100% free, and everyone is encouraged to attend and take these. They do require some time commitment. They are 7 sessions long, 1 night a week for 2.5 hours a night. So it is a commitment, but you learn a wealth of information and how to get prepared for yourselves and your families, and how to work with your neighbors, and how to work together as a community to survive the disaster. If you go to www.cert-la.com/eventbrite, that'll take you directly to the signups, and you can sign up there for the classes. One thing that we've been doing since the pandemic started are these monthly third Wednesday of the month trainings. And these trainings, we bring in different subjects, different topics. We do tend to repeat them maybe once a year. Sometimes on the higher demand topics, we'll do a couple of them a year. But one topic that has always been requested, but something that is not in my wheelhouse to teach, is psychological first aid. I've heard stories from the Red Cross about what it's like to be at a disaster, say a hurricane or a flood, and you're walking through a completely destroyed city or town, and there are people who are still there who have just survived this disaster, but the conditions that they survived in are horribly traumatic. And I've heard these stories before, and I couldn't even begin to wrap my head around the psychological implications for not only the people who survived, but also for the first responders or the second responders who come in after and are checking in on these people who've just suffered the worst tragedies in their life and are still living through it. And so when I saw Nick post about the psychological first aid class, I signed up for it. Unfortunately, the one session I was able to attend, he had to postpone. So I reached out to him and said, hey, would you mind coming and teaching this for our people? And so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Nick.
Thanks, Patrick. So hello from Santa Clara, California. I see that we've got folks here from, oh, okay. Just got the notification of the recording in progress. That's fine. Yeah, I think I ended up having to postpone because I was on a very early fire down in Orange County. If you heard, they had a 550-acre fire called the Jim Fire in March, and ended up there. So let me start sharing my screen. I've got a lot of material, so I'm going to move pretty fast and hopefully finish on time around 9 p.m. Pacific time. But this is not just psychological first aid, but resilience and psychological first aid, which really are the same topic. But the reason I teach resilience first is you can't give away what you haven't got. If you don't know what it means to be a resilient person yourself, you're not going to help someone else be resilient during and in the aftermath of a disaster or an emergency. So the picture there, actually, let me get I'm going to shut my video off just because that could be distracting, I think, if I could figure out how to get to that. There it is. I'll pop it back on here and there. The picture there is actually from the Antelope Fire up in near, that's Mount Shasta in the background. And that has to do with my day job. So a little bit about me. I am a firefighter and EMT and medical unit leader and public information officer with the United States Forest Service. I work on call. I'm not a full-time employee because I don't want to be. And I'm also with a local fire department here in town called Spring Valley Fire, which is a CAL FIRE cooperator. We work very closely with them. We backfill their stations, and it's essentially a volunteer department during the winter and becomes a paid department during the summer when we work for CAL FIRE. So I'm a medical unit leader on a Type 1 federal incident management team. That's the Southern Area Red Team, which is in the southeastern United States, even though I live here in California. As medical unit leader, I am in charge of all the medical and rescue resources on large disasters and emergencies and so forth, and that is primarily wildfires. But because it is a southeastern team, we can also respond to hurricanes, tornadoes, or whatever else might be going on. And the Type 1 teams respond to the largest and most complex incidents. So I am an EMT. I'm also a wilderness EMT through National Outdoor Leadership School, and I do teach CERT for San Jose and Milpitas Fire Department, and occasionally for others like you guys right now. And by the way, if I noticed there are folks from other CERT teams here, and I am very willing to put these on for other teams. This is the time of year I start to get busy though with wildland fires, and I tend to put all this stuff on hold until we see when fire season is starting to wind down, which typically has been November or so. The last few years I've been out well into November. For resilience and psychological first aid, my background is 18 years of experience with the Bay Area Critical Incident Stress Management Team. I'm also a chaplain with California Fire Chaplain Association. I came to that CISM team after a line of duty death in my family, and then they invited me to become a member of the team. Now I teach it, and I also write books about it. And I promise I won't do much of the promoting the books, but one reason I'm quite willing to do these webinars for free is the books I've written. So one is a little pocket guide to crisis response. It includes psychological first aid, but also some more advanced interventions. There is a book that goes with this class. I started teaching this webinar a few years ago, decided to put out a book that covers the same material and goes into some more depth. I'll talk about where it goes into more depth. And then big new book last year. Those other two are self-published. This is from HarperCollins Leadership. It's in distribution all over the world. Stress into Strength, really trying to change the way the world talks about stress. And you'll understand that better after I dive into this. I've done a few other things. I was a paramedic. I got my EMT in 1975, my paramedic in 1976. So you can tell if you can do math that I'm an old guy. Still doing firefighting though. Came out, that was in Pennsylvania, came out here to California. EMS licenses really didn't cross state lines back then. Did some other things for a long time, journalism, software executive, so forth, and then came back into public safety about 7 or 8 years ago. So the sources of the information you're going to get here come from a lot of different sources. So I have a lot of training from the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation, which really sets the standard for crisis intervention. The National Child Trauma Support Network and the Veterans Administration together created a psychological first aid class, and I'm going to recommend that you follow that. By the way, I'm watching the chat, and feel free to ask questions there. I try to keep an eye on that. So, in 2 hours, I'm going to give you a bit of this, but you really need more if you're going to be practicing this, and the online class is great. I'm going to recommend another online class that's really complementary to it from one of the founders of the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation, who was one of my instructors. And by the way, all my books are on Amazon. If you search on my name on Amazon, it'll probably bring up my author page that shows all 4 of the books that I have available right now. Another thing that went into this is the training I have from the California Fire Chaplain Association. Of course, the CERT disaster psychology module, and this builds on that. And really some great curriculum from the United States Air Force called Master Resilience Training, a 5-day class, but really solid stuff. And then, especially to write that last book, I read hundreds or maybe even thousands of professional articles, journal articles, and so forth. So why even teach people resilience? Well, we know people can learn resilience. We know that when we teach it to them, it actually works. They become more resilient. And even before COVID added this incredible layer of stress to our lives, we need it more than ever, just because a lot of social changes, as you hear what I talk about in terms of really what turns stress into strength. That's like that's the starting point here, rather than thinking of stress as an illness or a disease or something to get rid of. The things that turn stress into strength, we used to kind of get for free in our culture, maybe 30, 40, 50 years ago. And a lot of those have evaporated. We have to be far more intentional about them. So before I get into that kind of thing, if you learn about stress, you'll hear about stress hormones, and you'll hear this myth of toxic stress, stress will kill you and so forth, which unfortunately is a kind of a self-fulfilling thing. When we teach people that stress is bad for them, it becomes chronic, and it will become bad for them. Vivek, yes, the question I was asking Patrick before we started was about how we're going to get the slide deck to you. I'm going to either collect email addresses and names, or else Patrick's going to be able to get that from Zoom. And I'll be able to provide you with the slides and a certificate of participation. So stress is usually talked about this way. Here's a study from Canada that shows how much people spent feeling very stressed or not very stressed, but it's only half the story. And to explain why it's half the story, I'm going to start with a definition of stress, and then I'll explain why this is only half the story. But my super simple definition of stress is it's the things that make your heart beat faster and your brain and body's reaction that causes your heart to go faster. Oh, hang on a second. Was there any audio there? I don't think I'm sharing audio.
No, there was no audio.
Suddenly realized I didn't do one of the things that I always do. Let's get back to that. All right. Oops. So stress usually has this very negative connotation. But notice that all those pictures I put together, they're not all negative things, because our stress reactions aren't just to threats. We have stress reactions to opportunities and challenges, and we perform better. We're better able to seize opportunities. We're better able to rise to challenges. And of course, we're better able to deal with threats if our heart is beating a little faster and we have a little more focus and energy and so forth. So think of your stress reaction as your ally anytime you're facing an opportunity, a challenge, or a threat. But that is, as I've said, only half the story. The other half, the thing that turns stress into strength, I decided to call renewal. And I had to choose a word because we don't, the scientific establishment, psychologists, physiologists, don't really have an agreed upon word for what turns stress into strength, except in sports medicine. In sports medicine, they talk about getting the stress of exercise and practice and so forth. And then they say you need to recovery. So they talk about, exercise and recovery. But I didn't want to use the word recovery, because as soon as you move into psychology and you start talking about recovery, people think you're talking about addiction and recovery. And that's really not what I meant. So what I mean by renewal is kind of the opposite of stress. It's those things that make your heart beat slower. So here's the fundamental idea that I want you to come away from this with, that when you get stress and combine it with renewal, you build or maintain your strength and your resilience. But it's got to be the right kinds and amounts of stress. It's got to be the right kinds and amounts of renewal. And that's individual to you. Just like when you go to the gym, everybody needs to figure out their own routine. Everybody needs different amounts of sleep, different kind of, not everybody eats the same diet to be healthy and so forth. And we need these at the right intervals and kind of in the right rhythm. So the problem really isn't stress, it's that stuck stress reaction. I think when we teach people that stress is toxic, the reason it becomes toxic, and there was a huge study that showed this, that people who believe in the myth of toxic stress, it really becomes toxic. But people who don't believe in that myth actually live longer, even though they have really high stress, than people who believe that myth. So it's really about a stuck stress reaction. It's about stress being chronic. So rather than thinking of stress reduction, think of how am I interrupting my stress? How am I living my life as a series of maybe very stressful sprints rather than this marathon of chronic stress, which absolutely will wear you down, will hurt you. So I came up with this notion for the book of resilience routines, which are these rhythms of stress and renewal. And those help us to help our brain, our body, and even our spirit become more flexible so that that chronic stress response isn't sticky. And doing this helps, so this is an invitation to really embrace those high stress opportunities, challenges, and threats, but combine them with all these words that started with the letter C. Sorry, my slides advance automatically sometimes, and I got to turn that off. But courageous, committed, compassionate connections. So there's a number of people have talked about the fact that stress disconnects and renewal reconnects. Stress disconnects us even from paying attention to how we feel, because those stress hormones mask pain. We sometimes don't even notice that we've lost our perspective. And all those things help us rise to challenges and, sorry about that, seize opportunities and deal with threats. But they disconnect us. And courageous, committed, compassionate connections restore that. And I'm going to talk about those, and there's 3 dimensions that I've already mentioned: physical, social, and spiritual. And by spiritual, what I mean is your sense of meaning and purpose, aside from just the selfish stuff of taking care of you, money and power and that sort of thing. It's about your values. And psychologists have known for a long time that, sorry about the automatically advancing slides. Psychologists have known for a long time that having a sense of meaning and purpose in your life improves your well-being. So religion can be a source of those things, but I'm not talking, when I say spiritual, I'm not talking about religion, even though it is the source of that for many people, and a very important source of it. So let's say you wanted to get in better physical shape. You'd get yourself a coach. The coach would first, just like we emphasize in CERT all the time, that safety is number one. Your coach would tell you how to exercise safely. If you're using weight machines, your coach is going to describe how to use that machine without hurting yourself. Your coach is going to urge you to get a little bit out of your comfort zone. You don't have to go way, in fact, you don't want to go way outside your comfort zone, but you're not really going to build or even maintain your strength if you're not getting out of your comfort zone and sweating a little bit. Your coach is going to urge you to pay attention to your technique, right? If you're lifting weights, you want to lift and release smoothly, so you got to do it the right way. But a good coach will also encourage you to observe your own reaction to this exercise you're getting, because it needs to be tailored to you individually, just as all these resilience routines need to be tailored to your needs, both on the stress and renewal side. And a good coach will also urge you to track your long-term progress and just don't even really pay attention to what's happening in the short run, because in the short run, we're all over the place. One of the great things about smart watches and phones and so forth that track your health is they can give you a quick glance at how you're doing long-term, so you don't get hung up on short-term glitches and failures and so forth. And we'll talk a lot more about that. Your coach is going to help you find the right intervals. So if it's weightlifting, the right interval between sets, the right interval between workouts. A lot of times they say for building muscle strength, you only want to lift weights every other day. But again, that needs to be tailored to you. Your coach is going to tell you that when you're not getting your exercise, you do need to get enough sleep, enough rest, enough downtime, and nutrition. If you don't get protein, those muscles aren't going to grow. And then remember, this is kind of that spiritual part I was talking about. Remember why you exercise and the good it does, because that's a much more powerful motivator than I'm going to talk about later about shoulding on yourself, doing something because you should do it. That actually backfires almost every time. We'll come back to that. But this is very closely related to it, which is nobody keeps to their schedule. Even I'm sure that Olympic athletes and Navy SEALs have bad days. And it's like that old saying, it's not how many times you fall down, it's how many times you get back up. So it's that just start over. And I'll talk about how to do that. So none of this is to say that stress can't hurt you. Stress absolutely can hurt you, just like weightlifting can hurt you if you don't do it right. If you lift too much weight, if you don't take enough time between workouts and sets, if you don't get the right rest, nutrition, protein, so forth, all of those things will injure you. And this last thing is kind of what we call codependence. If you're running around the gym lifting everybody else's weights for them, you're really not helping them because they're not stressing their muscles the way they need to. And you're going to be lifting too much weight too often and probably not getting enough rest and nutrition. So you're not doing anybody any good if you lift their weights for them. So the thing with chronic stress is that it's cumulative and it can build up without us even noticing it. We like to talk about it sometimes as like you're wearing a backpack and every day you drop another small rock in it. So you never really feel it build up. But one day you just realize you're tired all the time. So we need to regularly stop and unload the backpack and let that stress turn into strength. But when you're feeling stress, remember it's because you care. Nobody feels stress about things they don't care about. And here's the good news. When you really give courageous, committed, compassionate care, that makes you more resilient. And there's a lot of good evidence to show that. So caring creates resilience, especially caring for other people, caring for our pets, our animals, caring for our gardens. All of those things have been shown to help make you more resilient, as well as, it helps them too. So if you know anything about stress, you've probably heard the phrase fight or flight. So that phrase was coined by a physiologist named Walter Cannon back around 1900. Walter Cannon was the first person to really describe what he labeled homeostasis, which is how our body returns to normal after stress. So he said our stress reaction gets us ready to fight or flee. And since then, people have added freeze because sometimes it goes even that much further and we freeze. But what Cannon came up with this idea of fight, the physical stress reaction is fight or flight. So there's the kitten who's ready to either fight or run away. Walter Cannon also came up with the phrase rest and digest to describe the thing he was talking about, homeostasis, how our body returns to normal. And he identified that we have these two parts of our autonomic nervous system that are in charge of that. Here's the crazy thing that has happened since then. We've paid way, way, way more attention to fight or flight than rest and digest. So I went into Google a couple of years ago, I guess, and I searched on these two phrases. And I found, didn't surprise me too much, 20 times as many mentions of fight or flight as rest and digest, which I think would sort of appall Walter Cannon, since rest and digest is really what he was mainly focused on in terms of homeostasis and sort of how we get back to that original state. But on the other hand, I wasn't terribly surprised because having studied psychology, I know that our brain has this thing called negative bias, or the default state of our brain is to be negative. We react more strongly to negative information. We repeat it a lot more. We warn our friends. This is why social media and the news are full of all kinds of negative stuff. It's why politicians run on negative ads and so forth, because people just react more strongly. And then I hoped that maybe if I searched the professional journals, since psychologists know about negative bias and so forth, maybe it would be better there. Well, I got that backwards. Searched Google Scholar, which indexes the professional journals, and there weren't 20 times as many fight or flight mentions as rest and digest. There were 40 times as many. So even within the scientific community, there's this really strong negative bias to talk about the negative effects of stress and very little talk about what I decided to call renewal, the rest and digest side of it. So that's the physical description of it. Now, although the physical, social, and spiritual are all interconnected and you never really have one by itself, I think it's helpful to think of it in those three dimensions. So the social fight or flight is to become defensive or to distance. So I think everybody's familiar with sort of feeling like when somebody's criticizing you or something, you want to get defensive, right? And some people are more defensive than others. A lot of people who've been through traumatic circumstances are what psychologists call highly defended. They just don't feel like it's safe to reveal how they really feel or what they're thinking and so forth. It's hard for them to be real with other people. And distancing, employers these days have a phrase they use called presenteeism. That's where people, it's not absenteeism because people show up for work physically, but they don't show up mentally. Presenteeism. And that's kind of what distancing is. So you can be in a crowd of people and still be mentally distanced from them. So that's our social stress reaction. And by the way, all these are the right things to do sometimes. I mean, there are people that we should defend ourselves from. There are people we it's healthy to distance ourselves from. And then the renewal reaction is called tend and befriend. And this also has an interesting background to it. It was first observed about 20 years ago or so when some women decided they wanted to study stress hormones in female subjects. That hadn't been done, because up until then, everybody studying stress reactions looked at male subjects, whether it was human beings or rats or whatever, mammals in general. They stuck to male subjects because they were concerned that the females' monthly hormonal cycles would mess up their data. So these women decided we're going to fix that. And what they found that jumped out at them was that for female subjects, after stress, their oxytocin levels spiked up. And oxytocin is a very interesting hormone. It affects us physically and mentally. And what it does mentally is it drives that tend and befriend behavior. And so they coined the term tend and befriend for how a more female response to stress behaves. So oxytocin is often described as a social bonding hormone. When a woman gives birth, her body is flooded with oxytocin, and that it's believed that helps the mother form this very strong bond to the baby. It has quite a few other interesting behavioral effects. When your oxytocin levels are higher, you're better at reading people's emotions. You're better at recognizing who your friends are. You're less suspicious. But it's been called the cuddle hormone or the love hormone because it is released when we touch each other. I kind of a running joke with a couple of my CAL FIRE friends who I learned about this with. When we see each other, we'll give each other a big hug and say, let the oxytocin flow, because hugging someone you trust will release oxytocin. So does eye contact, so does swallowing, which is why sharing meals is a tend and befriend activator, a renewal activator. Now, where those women got it wrong, though, I think, is they called it a stress hormone, predominantly. I mean, men have oxytocin too. The levels just don't spike as high after stress. But it really is something that happens following stress, and it helps repair social relationships. So to me, it's definitely a renewal hormone, and I'm going to talk about that a little more in just a moment. But first, the third dimension, spiritual, and this is about your priorities, your sense of purpose, your values, and so forth. And it is the most natural thing in the world for people to become more selfish and survivalist when they're facing an opportunity, a threat, or a challenge. Opportunity, challenge, or threat. And again, the right thing to do. I mean, we're telling you to store up 72 hours worth of supplies. That's kind of selfish in a way, because you're not storing it up for your neighbors. I'm going to share mine, but it's really for you and those closest to you. And under high stress, people sometimes do things that they would not do ethically or morally when they're not under high stress. I think we can all think of examples of that. So the spiritual renewal reaction is to kind of get that big picture perspective back and lose the tunnel vision. And that's been called pause and plan. So a lot of contemplative practices help us get that bigger picture back. And we'll come back to that some more. So the idea here, the core idea here, is that strength and resilience come from these rhythms of stress and renewal. So when we start talking about the specifics of psychological first aid, what that's going to be is you're going to be meeting with people who are under high stress, and you're going to do things that help activate that renewal reaction that's going to help repair the damage done by stress, and even in the long run, can make them stronger. So to recap here a bit, physical stress and renewal builds our strength for doing and owning things, so physical things. And then social stress and renewal helps us with greater mental and emotional strength, helps us think more clearly, and helps us self-regulate our emotions better. And then spiritual stress and renewal, as I talked about, helps us build that stronger sense of perspective, priorities, and purpose. And I think sometimes that might be a little hard to grasp, but it's actually pretty simple, I realized. So I have permission from one of my closest friends to talk about the fact that many, many years ago, a couple decades ago, he and his wife lost their 2-year-old son to a brain tumor. And it was horrible. Wouldn't wish it on anybody. But as so often is the case, they look back on it as bittersweet. Losing their son was terrible. The way the community surrounded them was wonderful. And it changed their priorities. they have a much stronger sense of what their priorities are and what's really important to them, much stronger sense of purpose and meaning in their lives. So that's what can happen with these, even some of the very worst kinds of stress. I suspect that some of you are in CERT for reasons like that. So I'm sure you've heard about stress hormones, right? And if you read about stress hormones, the two big ones are adrenaline and cortisol. So adrenaline gives us instant energy. Cortisol takes a little longer to be released, and it gives us more long-term energy. Those two hormones actually lower our sensitivity to pain. And that's exactly what you want especially if you're in danger, right? If there's been an earthquake, if there is a wildfire, you want to be able to run, move, solve problems and so forth without being distracted or slowed down by injuries you might have. So it helps us survive, right? However, one of the things that happens if our adrenaline and cortisol levels stay high, and stress is sticky, so it's easy for this to happen, those can produce chronic pain. So it lowers that immediate pain sensitivity, but it can produce chronic pain. And the big thing with those stress hormones when those levels stay high is chronic inflammation. And that's what leads to cardiovascular disease, heart attacks, strokes, and so forth. So when stress becomes toxic, that chronic inflammation is why it is so toxic to our health. So on the renewal side, although again, the scientific community doesn't tend to put them in this category, but if you look at what they do, it's very clear that oxytocin, as well as the androgens, human growth hormone, DHEA, are all renewal hormones because they repair the damage done by stress, and they stimulate growth. So they also, they will actually increase our pain sensitivity. So you lose the anesthetic effects of adrenaline and cortisol. So when you start activating renewal, you can start realizing that you've been walking around with some pain, and it might be physical pain, it might be emotional pain. And that is one of the obstacles, I think, to renewal. But in the long run, they relieve chronic pain and they lead to healing and growth. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about oxytocin because it's just fascinating what it does. So I mentioned that it's a social bonding hormone. If you spend time around people, or if you are a person with chronically elevated levels of adrenaline and cortisol, you tend to be irritable, jumpy, suspicious, distrusting, and so forth. That's kind of what stress does to us. But oxytocin actually helps us bond with people, and that tend and befriend response leads us to repair relationships that get broken by stress. Marriage, I mean, you hear about cops and firefighters and other public safety people who end up with really severe chronic stress. Their marriages fall apart, their children stop talking to them, and so forth. But oxytocin will lead through that tend and befriend behavioral response. It'll help people actually to recognize the emotions of the people around them, build trust, and so forth. But it isn't just, and that's a lot of what those researchers were looking at. But oxytocin also will repair physical damage done by stress, and specifically in the heart muscle. So if you go through high stress, the high levels of adrenaline can damage your cardiac muscle. Oxytocin repairs your heart muscle, the cardiac muscle. And that's just fascinating to me that this one hormone physically repairs and grows our physical heart, but also our social relationships. That is just kind of amazing to me, the way we're wired. So there's gonna be a few slides in here that are just for reference, so I'm not gonna go through it. That's just a recap of everything that's right out of the book, Stress and the Strength. So you'll have that, and a few others that I'm just gonna say, yeah, that's there for you when you get the slides. So Larissa says, this is also why vitamins are imperative under additional strength. Yeah, absolutely. I take a lot of supplements. We could go into that, but got a lot of material. I will be talking about diet, though. So if you want to become more resilient, here's the tricky thing. You kind of have to become an animal trainer of yourself. The reason I say that is there's a part of our brain, a part of our nervous system. Excuse me. There's a part of our nervous system, part of our brain, and if you care about it, the amygdala and the limbic system, which are kind of our stress autopilot. The higher our stress level, the more it's in charge. It's always kind of competing for being in charge with the front part. So it's the back of our brain, and it competes with the front part of our brain, the prefrontal cortex, which is the center of logic, It's where we get our willpower. It's where we get self-discipline. It's where motivation comes from. So when that monkey mind, the stress autopilot, is really activated, we don't have a lot of willpower, motivation, self-discipline, and so forth. Excuse me. So the idea of when we become more resilient, what we're doing is training that stress autopilot to be more flexible, to quiet down when it's not needed. It's our best friend when we need it because it helps us rise to challenges and so forth. But we want it to be flexible. We want it to quiet when the source of the stress goes away. And the monkey mind learns to be flexible from safety, companionship, and predictability. And it gets those. Somebody's microphone is on. If everybody could mute. Patrick, you can hit the mute all button there. That'll probably mute me. Anyway, it learns companionship, predictability, and safety from those things I talked about, from experiences of rest and digest, tend and befriend, and pause and plan. So we need more of that to become more resilient. But here's the tricky thing. I said that prefrontal cortex, the part that gets drowned out by the monkey mind, is where we get our motivation and self-discipline and so forth. So if you meet somebody who's highly resilient, you'll see that person's got a lot of motivation, a lot of self-discipline, a lot of willpower. And the mistake we make over and over, I think, is to think that that's how we make changes. That's how we become more resilient. If you're in chronic stress and you've got that activated stress autopilot, you cannot start with self-discipline. You can't start by just trying to summon up motivation and willpower because they're not there. They're there, but they're drowned out. So that's the result of practicing these resilience routines. That can't be the starting point for getting there. So at this point, it sounds like a little bit of a catch-22, right? How can I become more resilient if I don't have access to the part of my brain that gives me willpower, resilience, and so forth? The answer is pretty simple. It's start small and start over and give yourself unlimited permission to fail and begin again. I was talking to a guy that I've been coaching for a long time who was just really having a lot of anxiety about something. And I invited him, as I often do with people, I said, if you can just focus on your breathing for 10 seconds, and then maybe over time, get that up to 20 or 30 seconds, just focus on your breathing. That'll build up over time, but you got to keep starting over, right? And there's good research that shows if we can just find a way to take a vacation from the stress or the grief or whatever it is for even 30 seconds at a time, over time, when we look at the big picture, we'll see that that's building up. But don't should on yourself. And when we talk more about the specifics of psychological first aid, I want to really urge people who've been through these traumatic or high stress experiences to just get rid of all the shoulds. There's no way that they should recover. There's no way you should go through grief and so forth. So what I want to invite you to do for yourself and people you're helping is what psychologists call positive reframing. So should is a negative, change it into a positive. So instead of I should exercise today, the positive is, hey, by exercising, I'm staying healthier. I am 65 years, I turned 65 last year. Every spring, I have to pass this thing called the PAC test to qualify as a wildland firefighter. It's hiking 3 miles in 45 minutes, carrying a 45-pound pack. Believe me, at my age, that's pretty hard to do. And staying motivated to practice is not easy. It's a grind at my age. I mean, it was a grind when I was younger, but I know that if I should on myself, if I say, oh, I really should practice for the PAC test, that if I don't then go ahead, and sometimes I don't, sometimes I skip a day, I'm going to start feeling guilt, or even worse, I might start feeling shame. Guilt and shame are stress autopilot activators. So they backfire because when you activate that monkey mind, you have less motivation, you have less willpower, you have less self-discipline. So this is why should is such a dangerous word. So again, I should get rid of this clutter, change it, do the positive reframing. Better organization is going to help me relax more. So think about what's the positive benefit rather than shooting on yourself. And then when you fail, whether it's for an hour, a day, or a year, just be willing to start over. So if the background noise you're hearing is a dog barking, that's one of my dogs. He is compelled to bark at anybody who walks by. because dogs don't know the difference between correlation and causation. So he barks at people and they continue walking down the street, and in his mind, it's the barking that made them keep going. Just like dogs will always bark at the mailman or the UPS driver, whoever, because they bark and the mailman goes away. They bark and the UPS driver goes away. This is a little psychology lesson for you. Dogs aren't smart enough to realize that it's not the barking that's causing it. So it's this positive reinforcement. So they'll just bark more and more. And even nice dogs, like we have nice dogs, can become very aggressive toward delivery people because they think they're dominating them, because it's like every day for the last 5 years, every time I bark at that mailman, he goes away. So I dominate him. That's actually a good lesson. You can apply to many things. So I'm going to dive a little deeper into physical, social, and spiritual resilience. So remember, physical stress and renewal, that was fight or flight plus rest and digest, that gives us strength for doing, owning, and using things. So physical stressors, we have a lot of these in disasters and emergencies. People might get hurt, they might get sick, the environmental stuff, people wear themselves out. Certain team members wear themselves out. Try not to do that. Try not to do too much. People don't drink enough water. That's a big issue, of course, on our wildland fires when it's really hot outside. Although I actually also get fooled sometimes when it's cool outside. I don't drink enough water because there isn't the heat to remind me to do that. Or not eating enough, not having enough money, not having a roof over your head, or just not even maybe not having the skills or tools to be able to earn a living and so forth. Those are all physical things that can stress us. So to activate physical stress and renewal, exercise, of course, works well. And exercise is limited. It's something we do in a rhythm. Presumably we try to do that and get that sleep, rest, protein, and so forth. And it's also about building muscle memory. And by the way, sleep is a really important part of that. I'm going to recommend a book in each of these sections, and the one for this section is on sleep. The guy who wrote it likes to talk about the fact that even really great piano players, when they learn a new piece, they will make mistakes playing it the same day, but one good night's sleep, and all of a sudden they can play it perfectly. So he's got this line that, practice doesn't make perfect. It's practice plus a good night's sleep makes perfect. Just another example of how renewal is so important, and we're learning that sleep is just critically important. So managing possessions, I've never seen Marie Kondo's show Tidying Up, but I've certainly heard about it, and the basic idea there that having too much stuff can be stressful, just like having too little stuff is very stressful. I mentioned before that touch activates, release of oxytocin and so forth, but that's touch with trusted people. Interesting studies out there which shows, like, if you get a massage from somebody you trust, oxytocin flows, renewal is activated. You get a massage from a stranger, that doesn't happen. So it has everything to do with sort of who you consider your circle of people, what psychologists call your in-group versus your out-group. Diet, very important, rest and sleep. I'm going to go in a little deeper into both of those. And then nature, turns out, there's not a ton of evidence, but there's a lot of good scientific evidence that spending time in nature makes a real difference. And this is a tradition in some other parts of the world. I think it's in Japan, they talk about forest bathing. And nobody really knows if it's exposure to some of the natural stuff you find in the forest, or just the fact that the forest isn't a constructed thing. It takes care of itself. One of the things I love about my job is that I train and I work in the great outdoors. It's on fire sometimes, but that's okay. Fire is a natural part of it. It's not all good, because our fires have gotten really insane, but it is wonderful to be working out in nature. So I've mentioned a few physiological terms and so forth, but wasn't really urging you to learn them. But this one is a good one to know: interoception. So interoception is your awareness of what your body is doing and how your body feels. And remember, I said cortisol and adrenaline, stress hormones they're kind of anesthetic. They disconnect us even from being aware of what's going on with our own body. So one of the shortcuts to physical reconnection and activating physical renewal are things like this: progressive muscle relaxation. You can look that up online. It's a very simple technique. Yoga, or there are people who want to avoid some of the religious sources of yoga. But you can do the same thing and call it body movement relaxation. It still works. It's still amazingly good. You may have noticed in the slides about Renewal, there was a picture of some on-duty firefighters doing yoga. And that's a woman named Shannon McQuaid, whose father was a San Jose firefighter here. Shannon now, she has a company called Fireflex Yoga, and she has contracts to go help firefighters do yoga. She leads yoga with firefighters all around Northern California. And I've done yoga with them, and it was amazing. Driving home, just feeling like, man, I don't know when I felt this relaxed. Good stuff. So other mind-body practices like Pilates, Tai Chi, martial arts, and so forth, all of these are sort of shortcuts that build interoception, which is really, it's just physically reconnecting again with your own body after stress disconnects you. So here are some of those slides that I'm not going to go through in detail, but they're going to be there. Yeah, massage school. But I do want to talk sort of generally about breathing. When you exhale, your heart slows down. And the amount by which it speeds up and slows down is called heart rate variability. And I think more and more people are hearing about this because the heart chest straps and some of the smartwatches actually measure HRV, as it's called, heart rate variability. The higher your heart rate variability is, the more resilient you are physically and mentally. And that's kind of a wild, broad statement, but the more your heart speeds up and slows down, and if you practice these resilience routines, any of them, including exercising regularly, your heart rate variability will increase. And what it's basically telling you is what's going on with your vagus nerve, which is the biggest nerve in your body. Your vagus nerve is part of the parasympathetic nervous system. That's the rest and digest system. And it connects your gut to your brain. And by the way, a lot of scientists are now calling your gut your second brain because there's so many nerve cells in your gut. And we know that the state of your gut really has a huge impact on the state of your mind. And we'll come back to that when we talk about diet and so forth. But increasing heart rate variability is essentially, it correlates to waking up that vagus nerve. And the more awake that vagus nerve is, the more resilient you are. And it's so powerful that if you put a biofeedback app on your phone that coaches you through breathing to increase your heart rate variability, if that's all you do, you will become more physically and mentally resilient, which just blows my mind that a simple biofeedback to change how much your heart is speeding up and slowing down makes you more resilient. And by the way, dogs have really high heart rate variability. I'll talk about animals a little later on, but dogs are pretty flexible. They're great. They're a supportive dog is just an incredible asset in terms of your resilience, and they're pretty resilient themselves because apparently they're really well wired for resiliency. Because if you take your dog's pulse, you'll notice it really speeds up and slows down as they breathe in and out. So breathing is this pretty cool shortcut for resiliency. So here's another simple breathing technique. And by the way, I'll mention when we come to the actually how to do psychological first aid, you can use these techniques to invite people to help relax and get some of that renewal activated and lower the stress response. This grounding there, and this is only there are a number of different ways to do grounding, but for people who are very anxious, you can invite them, and it should always be an invitation. And I'll really emphasize that again when we talk about psychological first aid techniques. But the reason it has to be an invitation is your monkey mind likes control. Remember I said it likes control and predictability. So if you tell somebody, hey, do this, it'll lower your anxiety, that's going to backfire, because instead of inviting them to take control, you're trying to take control. And big issue sometimes for those of us who work in public safety, because we're all problem solving, action oriented people, and we just want to solve the problem. But we need to make almost everything, an invitation when we're helping others with this. So this is an invitation for you. If you're ever feeling anxious, you can try this. Oddly enough, the place I find myself using this grounding technique more than anywhere else is at Levi's Stadium. I'm on the medical team for the 49ers. And this is for the stadium, not for the players. They get much more qualified people for the players. In fact, I will boast, I was the rookie of the year for the San Francisco 49ers on the medical team a few years ago. I like telling people that and watch them look at me like, have I seen you on TV? Yeah, it's just for the medical team. Anyway, we get. I think it's the crowds and just something about the stadium atmosphere that seems to trigger anxiety in people. It's not the score of the game; they're never worried about whether the Niners are winning or losing. But I wind up using this, and I'll just invite people to just go through this. So that'll be there for a reference for you. And then butterfly hug tapping is another physical shortcut where you kind of cross your arms and you tap your shoulders alternately. What most people end up doing is doing it quickly and then noticing they're going too fast and slowing down again. This is interesting because there are a number of different techniques, some you can do yourself, some that are done by clinicians, that stimulate the two sides of your brain alternately. And we'll talk about that a little more when we get to sleep. Because when we get into that deep, rapid eye movement sleep, some of the same kind of thing is happening, and it helps us to process high stress and traumatic events. So again, another, and this one, by the way, is a real good one with children. So we're going to talk about food. If you eat processed food versus unprocessed food, processed food is much easier to digest, right? So whole grains, unprocessed foods, those are harder for your gut to digest. And that's good for you. So this is kind of another example of how stress is good for you. And it's good for you for two reasons. The first reason is that most of us, not everybody, but most of us are getting more calories than we need. So when we eat processed food, more of the calories in the food are available to digest, and we overeat, right? When we eat whole grains and unprocessed foods, we can't get to a lot of those calories. And in addition to the fact that that means we're not overeating as much, all the things we can't digest for ourselves is food for all the microorganisms that live in our gut. And more is being discovered about that all the time. It's called your gut biome or your gut biota, or there's actually several different names for it, gut fauna sometimes. And what the big thing we know about the gut biome is that having a huge variety of organisms is healthy. That when you don't have several thousand different kinds in your gut, you're not going to be as healthy. You're going to have chronic inflammation problems. It's related to pretty much the top 10 leading causes of death and illness. What we don't know is what the right mix is. And there's only 10 or 12 organisms that we know are really important. So, and this all goes into why we have probiotics and prebiotics and so forth, because it's all about feeding that gut biome. So be careful if you buy things like that to make sure that whatever it's supplying you with is really one of those things that science has shown is one of the ones we really need. Otherwise, it's good to just get a real variety, and eating an anti-inflammatory diet is kind of the shortcut to learning how to eat well in terms of stress. And the big thing to avoid, because it feeds inflammation, is carbohydrates. And one of the worst sources of carbohydrates is your typical soft drink. And the best way I've found to explain that to people is, if you're an iced tea drinker, you probably would not put 25 sugar packets into one glass of iced tea, but that's essentially what you're getting in a can of Coke or a can of Sprite or something like that with that high fructose corn syrup. It's just a crazy amount of carbohydrates, and carbs just feed inflammation. But by the way, cortisol, that stress hormone, makes us crave carbohydrates. So the more stress we're under, I can hear the potato chips calling me when I don't get enough sleep, which raises my cortisol levels. And once I learned that, it's actually a little easier for me to resist eating all the carbs, because I'm like, oh, that's the cortisol is making me crave it. And it's just, I guess it makes it a little easier for me to resist it. So avoid carbs, avoid highly processed foods for the reason I just talked about. Watch out for trans fats. And if you have snacks with a really long shelf life, it's probably because they have a lot of trans fats. I think we all know fried foods we need to limit. And low fat and low carb labeled foods often can backfire because they will stimulate our appetites, and then we end up actually eating too much because we've been eating that low fat, low carb stuff. So there's lots more to know, but that's the quickie on diet. And then sleep. So since you're all CERT folks, you may respond to disaster, you may already have. Most people have at least one big traumatic incident in their life. But after those really big crises, it is extremely important to get a good night's sleep, especially for a few nights, but that first night in particular. So So let me explain what happens during REM sleep related to trauma and stress. Your brain disconnects the memory of what happened from the way you felt while it was happening. If your brain doesn't get a chance to do that, every time you remember what happened, it's going to feel like it's happening all over again. And when that persists for a month or more, that's what leads to anxiety disorders and post-traumatic stress injuries and so forth. And it turns out there's a really high correlation between sleep disorders and susceptibility to post-traumatic stress disorders. So, so you want it. So after going through a crisis, it's very important to avoid any substance that's going to stop your brain from getting into REM sleep. And the big one's alcohol. So we used to say, moderate your alcohol intake. We'd acknowledge to people that, yeah, it may be very attractive. It may be something you want to, it's normal to have strong cravings for alcohol after a high stress event, but it's not a good way to relax because it'll keep you from getting into REM sleep. Your brain won't be able to process this. And then anti-anxiety drugs, all the benzodiazepines like Xanax and Valium and so forth, all those will keep you from getting into REM sleep. And some of the, especially the older sleep medications. So the sleep experts pretty much concur that you should only use sleeping pills if you absolutely need them. But if you need them, you need them. And sleep is critical. People die and horrible things happen if you don't get good sleep. And especially if you're not sleeping at all. So talk to your doctor. I'm not a doctor. I'm not going to recommend anything, but ask your doctor for something that doesn't interfere with REM sleep. And by the way, if you're having nightmares, make sure you mention that to your doctor because some of the sleep aids can provoke nightmares. I had caught a little off guard by that. Was having some trouble sleeping. My doctor gave me something. I started having these bizarre nightmares. And then I was at a conference, one of our peer support conferences, and the psychologist was talking about the different sleep aids, and she mentioned that one creates nightmares, or it can, not for everybody. It's okay to take short naps. I do this when I'm working really long hours. There's one recent study that said that you either have to nap or you don't. You're not going to get any benefit if you don't nap regularly. But the benefit of naps is simply to reduce your daytime sleepiness. Naps don't replace sleep because nothing ever replaces sleep. Lost sleep is lost forever. And chronically not getting enough sleep sets you up for, again, it's tied in with that inflammation, and it sets you up for all the leading causes of death. It sets you up, clearly we now know, sets you up for dementia, Alzheimer's, and other stuff like that. So also avoid stimulants close to bedtime. Now, coffee, I love coffee, and I'm happy to report that there's a pretty good scientific consensus that 4 or 5 cups of coffee a day are good for you for most people. There are exceptions. Less than that, you don't get the benefits. More than that, it starts to backfire. But you do want to cut off the coffee early afternoon because caffeine has a very long half-life and you want it out of your system by the time you're trying to go to sleep. And so avoid other stimulants close to bedtime. You want your room to be dark. I do have to work nights sometimes, so I have blackout curtains to really, really make the room dark. And blue light interferes with production of melatonin. Espresso martinis. Well, in the morning, maybe not. So exposing your eyes to blue light causes your body to not produce melatonin, and melatonin is what makes us sleepy. There is a misconception about melatonin. It's really not a sleeping pill. It helps us get to sleep. It does nothing to help us stay asleep. So if you're trying to stay asleep, don't take a bunch of melatonin. That's not going to work. It's just going to help you get sleepy. But the blue light will stop the natural melatonin from happening. So you can get software, I think, for pretty much any phone, computer, tablet, whatever, that will turn down the blue light as your bedtime approaches. I have it on everything I own, so because I know how important sleep is. So try to stick to a regular sleep schedule. My friends in public safety just laugh at that. But even, when I'm on a big incident or something, and it is, we do get interrupted, we're on call for medical emergencies in the middle of the night. It would be easy to not have a regular sleep schedule, but I do try to stick with it. Is 4 hours enough sleep? No, for almost there's almost nobody for whom 4 hours sleep is enough. In fact, if you read the book I'm going to recommend, you'll see that he talks about the fact that we now, because of computers and sensors, we know a lot more about what happens during sleep than we used to. And it is crystal clear that for most adults, getting less than 7 or 8 hours of sleep a night has very bad long-term effects. And he likes to point out, it's an unscientific sample, but a couple of world leaders who boasted that they got by on 4 or 5 hours of sleep a night, Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, both developed Alzheimer's. And cutting off your sleep early, we know can contribute to lead to Alzheimer's, because it's at the end of the sleep that your brain kind of flushes out that plaque that leads to Alzheimer's. So 4 hours a night is not enough. And a lot of people who think they're okay with that are going to have a very sad discovery later in their life that it wasn't so great. So you can do routines that will help signal to your brain and your body that it's time to sleep: warm shower, aromatherapy, reading, stretching. Those breathing exercises I mentioned before, progressive muscle relaxation. The Blue Blocker app, I don't know, I can't, off the top of my head, I don't know the names of any of them. They shouldn't be too hard to find. So Patrick says Android phones have it built in. I think actually iOS has it built in now. Now that I think about it, just I would look for screen color or screen and sleep, something like that. Maybe some other folks will know the names of some of them. Was that a question about daytime, nighttime sleep? If that was a question, the answer is yes. You really need the same kind of sleep, whether you're sleeping during the day or at night. What's really awful for your body is to keep changing it. Rotating shifts are the work of the devil. They're just really not good for anybody. How can you get straight sleep if you get up to pee? Well, I told you I'm 65, so I'm sympathetic. Okay, I'm going to tell you a story now. I was visiting my mother, who was living in a senior citizen community, about fire camp and being on a fire up in in Montana in the middle of the winter. I mean, sorry, the words are coming out all wrong here. In the middle of summer, but it felt like winter, because in Montana, it can snow pretty much any night of the year. And I was telling her how we were being careful how much water we would drink toward bedtime, so we didn't have to get up in the middle of the night and either go out in the woods, as we have to sometimes, or use the porta potties if things are a little better. And she looks at me and says, "That's the same conversation we have around here all the time." Just, so yeah, it is what it is. Stuff happens to our bodies as we get older. Our body temperature needs to drop a couple degrees for us to stay asleep. So you want to sleep in a cool place if at all possible. The nightmare for me is getting assigned to work nights and then trying to sleep in a hot tent during the day, because very often on our wildland fires, even in Montana, it can be pretty hot during the daytime. And the sleep experts tell us that our bedroom really should just be for sleeping and sex. No TV, no phone calls, no business. And sometimes you'll find that if you've responded to a disaster or something, or some high stress event in your life, you'll get in this condition that we call tired and wired, where you're driving home and you can barely keep your eyes open at the wheel of your car, but then you get into bed and you're wide awake. You're exhausted, but you just can't fall asleep. So a couple of psychologists kind of independently realized that the reason you're falling asleep when you're driving your car is that scenery moving, that familiar scenery going by. So their suggestion was, watch a light comedy you've seen a few times before, so your brain knows exactly what's going to happen. And that'll sort of reproduce what was happening when you're driving. And I can tell you, this works. This really works for me if I get into that kind of tired and wired state. And don't pressure yourself. Don't lie there in bed pressuring yourself to sleep. That'll keep you awake. Just say to yourself, okay, I'm getting in bed to rest, whether I fall asleep or not. And if you're lying there for 15 minutes and you're not falling asleep, the general recommendation is, get up and do something till you're sleepy and go back and lie down to rest again. I see we're getting some recommendations for software. Night shift. Yeah, I remember that now. Yep. Okay, so we are getting some recommendations. I guess it became so popular, the company started building it in, but you can also get it for desktop machines as well. So yeah, pay attention to whether you're getting enough sleep. or not. If you're falling asleep during the day, fall asleep at the wheel of your car. If you're not waking up rested, if you're waking up with a big headache every morning, you might need more sleep. Talk to your doctor. You might need a sleep study. So the recommendation is this great book. Matthew Walker's a researcher at Cal Berkeley. Why We Sleep. Fantastic book. After I read it, I thought, man, if everybody in the United States would just read this book and follow what it says, a lot of our both medical and behavioral issues would go away. Oh, the movie Night Shift. I was trying to figure out what that meant. Reading while talking. All right. So now moving on, the next area, mental and emotional resilience really come from that social stress and renewal. So defend and distance stress and tendon and befriend renewal build up that strength for thinking more clearly, regulating our emotions, and that, bonding with others through tendon, befriend, caring, and so forth. So the big social stressors are kind of what you might imagine. Being isolated, not quite the same as solitude. Some of us are introverts. We need our alone time, but that's when we can choose it, and we know when it's going to be over. Isolation is when you didn't choose it. You don't know when it's going to end. So feeling lonely, abandoned, unappreciated, unwanted. Criticism can be a potent social stressor, of course, and embarrassment. And guilt and shame, which, as I mentioned before, can be pretty big traps to keep that stress autopilot activated. So just as doctors and others will tell you it's important to get the stress of physical exercise for your health, it's clear that it's also important to get some social stress to remain stronger mentally and emotionally. And what that means is we need friends we can be real with, essentially. And they got to be safe people. We need trusted friends who we can be vulnerable with. This is an idea that if you've ever read the author Brené Brown, and we're going to see a little video from her in a moment, she talks a lot about this. And I loved what she was writing. And then one day the light bulb went off that, this is the healthy social stress that we need. And we're not getting nearly as much of it because so many more people, especially in the United States today, don't have really close friends. Vivek Murthy, the former surgeon, or Surgeon General again, I think, wrote a whole book about loneliness. That's a real eye opener. But we need people we can be real with. So the idea is to have trusted companions who get to see the real you, but don't rush into that. Just as you wouldn't rush into lifting a lot of heavy weights and a big workout at the gym, rushing into those in relationships with people will probably backfire. It'll probably be, if like lifting too much weights, it can hurt, and you might not ever go back to those people because you're like, what did I do? I just, opened up with this person I barely know. And you're running the risk of betrayal, and betrayal is bad news. You really don't want to trust people who haven't earned your trust. Fitbit, I have a Garmin smartwatch, and it uses heart rate variability, I think, to track my sleep. And I've never really looked into how accurate that really is, but it gives me a report on how many hours of REM and the other types of sleep I'm getting each night, which is interesting. And just like at the gym where you have to get out of your comfort zone, it is important that as you interact with these trusted companions on the road of life, that you get out of your comfort zone a little. Again, no need, no reason to step way outside of it. But do think of that as going to the gym for your mental health. So let's have Brené here. We'll probably get a YouTube ad before we see Brené, but hopefully that will not be too awful.
Check out this Verbo.
Oh, man. Michael, they're your cousins.
So I think the biggest myth about vulnerability is that it's weakness. I think a lot of people were raised to believe that. It was modeled, I think, certainly in our culture. We see that a lot, that to be vulnerable, to be open, to be exposed is to be weak. And the truth is, what I found in my research is that vulnerability is not weakness. In fact, I would argue that it's our greatest measure of courage. When we went out and asked people, what is vulnerability? We heard things like, vulnerability is the first date after my divorce. Vulnerability is starting my own company. Vulnerability is taking responsibility for something that went wrong at work. Vulnerability is sitting with my wife who has stage 3 breast cancer and making plans for our young kids. Vulnerability is taking my business public. The definition I use in my work of vulnerability is simply uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure. Vulnerability is about the willingness to show up and to be seen, even when there are no guarantees. And it's interesting to me. I mean, one of the things that I thought was really interesting, I gave a talk, it's probably a couple of years now, and it was being translated by people doing American Sign Language. And they came up before the talk started and they said, are there any words that you're going to use a lot in your talk that we should know about that or might be different? And I said, well, I use the word vulnerability a lot. And they kind of, there were two of them, and they kind of looked at each other and they said, oh, we do this for vulnerability. And I said, what does that mean? They said, it means weak in the knees. And I'm like, wow, that's not how I talk about vulnerability. And she said, well, there's only one other sign for vulnerability. And I said, what is it? And she said, and I said, oh, that's what I'm talking about. And so to me, vulnerability is our most accurate measure of courage. I mean, it's pretty powerful when I have 13,000 pieces of data collected over 12 years that I cannot find a single incident or story of courage that was not completely underpinned by vulnerability. I think the problem arises that there's so many little paradoxes with vulnerability, and one of them is that vulnerability is courage in you, but weakness in me. When I meet you, it's the first thing I look for in you, but it's the last thing I want to show you in me. And so I think to really put ourselves out there, knowing that if we do that enough, we're going to fail, I just don't think it gets more courageous than that.
All right, where are we at? Let's see. So somebody asked about the Oura ring. So with heart rate variability in particular, it's not clear that anything other than a chest strap gives you accurate enough data to really work with. It will report data for sure, and my wristwatch from Garmin will report heart rate variability, but it's not clear that it's super accurate. Adam, you said please share the link. You mean the link to Brené's? If you mean the link to Brené's video, all of these links will be in the slides that you will get. To activate social renewal, that tend and befriend response, always remember that service and sacrifice to one another will bond us far more than agreeing. Agreeing is much more about our sharing our thoughts, and service and sacrifice, that caring, that compassionate, committed caring, and connecting with people is really what creates resilience. So all the things we do around cooperation, communication, even competition with trusted companions can be a way to activate that social renewal, and of course teamwork is. So the idea is to have a diverse set of social support resources, whether it's friends, coaches, mentors, and so forth, who will walk with you without really judging you or trying to fix you or make you better. And that's something to remember too. We'll talk a bit about it in sort of the hands-on aspects of psychological first aid. But one of the things that came out of COVID is that a lot of couples felt a lot of stress in their relationship because they were leaning on each other for almost everything. And it's clear that we need, as we need diverse gut biome, all these different organisms, we need diverse social support. We get different things from different people. And when we put everything on our spouse, that's not necessarily the healthiest thing. So the monkey mind does not like to think, it does not like isolation. It's really important and really powerful for people to know that, they're not going crazy. They're not the only one who reacts this way to stress and so forth. And that's one of the things that we can also do for people who are in crisis, to just reassure them, acknowledge what you hear in terms of the thoughts and emotions that they're experiencing, and reassure them that it may not feel normal, but they're having a natural reaction. And when they can reassure each other that they're having the same kinds of reactions, that's really helpful. So we want that diverse source of social support: friends, family, mentors, coaches, and teams, and so forth, plus animals. So I did mention that was our dog barking in the background. He's been mostly quiet. So I had the privilege of introducing Cal Fire to the dog in the green vest and other dogs from the same organization. It's called Hope Animal Assisted Crisis Response. Back at when we had the North Bay fires here in the Bay Area a few years ago, I had no idea that this would lead to what's become a long-term partnership between CAL FIRE and HOPE, and now HOPE responds to some of our federal fires as well, along with other emotional support dogs. In the upper right picture, the three guys there are from CAL FIRE's Employee Support Services unit that I worked for occasionally, not so much. I don't have much time for them anymore. And the guy on his phone, the guy with the silver hair there, that's the guy that when we see each other, we give each other a hug and say, let the oxytocin flow. By the way, that oxytocin flows when we interact with the dog. The dog's oxytocin flows, and so does ours. When we pet them, when we make eye contact, when we have that supportive relationship. Same thing apparently with dolphins. It's because it's a mammalian response. And then horses are also powerful allies in terms of social support, although it's a little different because horses are prey animals. Their eyes face to the side to watch out for predators, and their main means of dealing with predators is flight. They run very fast. Where dogs, they're predators. Their eyes face forward. So a supportive dog will come to you when the dog senses you're upset and do what it can to comfort you. A horse will do the opposite. If you get into a round pen with a horse and you're upset, the horse won't come to you until you figure out how to calm down. But that's great feedback, right? Because that can coach you and teach you how to activate your own renewal response, slow down your heart rate. They say horses can sense our heart rate from pretty far away. They're really amazing animals. And then in the lower right, that is Sunny. She is a sun conure who flew into our backyard a few years back. I figured we'd find her owner very quickly because they're expensive birds, but we never could figure out, I'd say who she belonged to, but in her mind, it's really the other way around. She's not really ours. We are her staff. Somebody told us having a sun conure is like having a 4-year-old who never grows up. It's a lot like that. She's quiet right now because she's sitting on some eggs. There's no male bird around, so we know they're not going to hatch, but we're just going to let her go through that until she's done, because if we take the eggs away, she'll just keep laying eggs. That's not good for them. But somebody told us they're cuddly, and I thought, a cuddly bird? What? It's true. And they bond incredibly tightly, and they're just wonderful. All right, the two humans are staring at their phones. Well, working on a fire involves a lot of communications. But yeah, the dogs are definitely alert to what's going on. The dogs are a little more present, I guess. Oh man, nobody ever pointed that. I've done this webinar many, many times. Nobody ever pointed that out. Anyway, you'll have a link to a couple of the dog organizations I've worked with, HOPE and Canine First Responders, which is based on the East Coast. Went with them to Las Vegas to work with the Las Vegas fire after the big, I think it was called the Highway 51 shooting, the one where 500 people were shot, including some firefighters and their families. So the book I'm going to recommend here shouldn't be a big surprise. Brene Brown, any of her books are good. This is a good book to start with, although her current book that just came out, which may still be the #1 book in the world, Atlas of the Heart, that's not a bad one to start with as well. Her other books, I would read this one before the others, but it's all great stuff. Anything she has written, and she has lots of videos and so forth. All right, so we'll come back to social support and psychological first aid because that's a lot of what it's about. Spiritual resilience. So that was selfish and survivalist stress combined with pause and plan renewal that gives us greater strength for our priorities, our perspective. It helps us get rid of that tunnel vision that stress gives us. So the spiritual stressors are things that make us feel like life is meaningless, aimless. Betrayal can do that. Losing control, helplessness. The monkey mind really likes to feel like you're in control, and feeling extremely helpless when the stakes are high, especially if it's one of these disasters where we respond and it's life and death and we feel helpless. That's very often the worst stress people feel. When things feel uncontrollable and unpredictable, those are big spiritual stressors. So to become more spiritually resilient, it's about growing your perspective, learning and living out a set of values. And when I talk about the ways society has changed, people used to get a lot of their values from institutions like the church, which, churches have lost a lot of their credibility for, better or worse. And I think it's for worse. Whether you agree with those values or not, there's a void that's been created. People don't trust the news media like they used to. They don't trust politicians. I mean, we never trusted politicians completely, but, politics has become a lot more cynical. A lot of these human institutions that were sources of values have lost that broad impact, and we're living in a time when we're reinventing sources of authority and value and so forth. So building spiritual resilience is also about knowing why you do what you do, aside from just gaining money and power and those kinds of things, having that real sense of purpose and meaning in your life. And by the way, volunteering for something like CERT definitely is one of the things that does that. You know, like I said, service and sacrifice bond us much more than agreeing on things. Hopefully on your CERT teams, just like on our fires and so forth, we don't talk, we leave all the politics and everything behind. And we are really much more bonded. Even though if we started talking about politics, we'd probably discover we don't agree on everything, maybe really disagree, but we absolutely agree on the mission we're doing together and that purpose of serving others. Cultivating a sense of wonder and awe really seems to help, because I think that helps us maintain the big picture perspective. So this nice way somebody described this is kind of your heart keeping your ego in check. So things that really help us pause and plan, I would lump under this term contemplative practices. So they quiet the stress autopilot. The monkey mind is always in the past or the future. It's either producing anxiety because of things that happened to you in the past, or worrying about things that might happen in the future. And as always, there's a good reason it does it. It's urging you to learn. So it's replaying, in a sense, these past things that happened, because it's trying to get you to rehearse. In case something like that happens again, you can learn to do better. And human beings have done that over the millennia. We learn to cope better with all sorts of things. So that's the good side of it, but you don't want to live there. It's a terrible place to live. So you want to get back into the present and get that normal sense of time, because stress will make time seem to speed up or slow down, turn off that tunnel vision, get our perspective back. So the kinds of things that do this are meditation, prayer, unplugging, retreating, keeping a journal. And then mindfulness is more a way of doing other things in a way that is where you're noticing when your mind is not in the present and sort of coming back to the present. Remember I said stress disconnects, and it can kind of disconnect us from noticing what our own brain is doing. So yoga helps us notice. Actually, yoga does both. All those mind-body practices do both. So part of it is that interoception, which is where you reconnect with your own body by learning to notice what it's doing. And the mental part of it is to reconnect with your own mind by becoming more aware of noticing when your brain is drifting off to the past or future and so forth. So sometimes people say, I'm really bad at meditation. My brain keeps drifting off. Well, in a sense, you're actually good at it, because unlike a lot of people, you notice when your brain drifts off and then you come back to the present. And that's kind of the muscle you're exercising when you do this type of meditation. So the book I'm going to recommend here might seem a little surprising. It's called Forgive for Good by Fred Luskin, who's at Stanford, head of the Forgiveness Project. Notice the subhead, which is up at the top there. It says, holding a grudge is hazardous to your health. And so Luskin talks about the fact that forgiveness is really not about whoever you're forgiving or whatever you're forgiving. It's really about you and what it does to us to carry a grudge. A couple of the insights that I got from, I learned about this at a retreat we put on for first responders who are really struggling with post-traumatic stress. We call it a retreat because if we called it what it really is, nobody would come. It's really inpatient psychotherapy, and it's put on entirely by volunteers who either are first responders or they're clinicians with tremendous experience with first responders. And every time they do these retreats, they use the techniques in this book. So Luskin talks about having what he calls a grievance story, which is a story that never changes when you tell it, but how, somebody done you wrong. And there's probably, I think most people, you'll meet somebody who just will have a story. And sometimes we will notice that we have a story that we're repeating, and it's really not getting any better. We're really not rewriting that story as we tell it. Because very often telling your story can be healing if you figure out how to rewrite it in a healthy way. So what Luskin talks about is when we have a grievance story, there's something that needs to be forgiven there, and forgiveness is both a decision and a process. And one of the mistakes we can make, and I think especially those of us in the Christian faith, can feel like there's a lot of pressure to forgive right away. And the decision to forgive you can make right away. But what Luskin points out is you really can't emotionally forgive pain that you haven't acknowledged yet. So before we can really go through this whole process of fully forgiving, we have to acknowledge to ourselves how much pain this other person who we're forgiving or the event, whatever it was, caused us. And if we're in too much of a rush with that decision to forgive, we can actually stuff down those feelings and make it the process that much harder to get to, and it's going to come out in all sorts of other ways. So forgive for good. So to transition toward some of the more nuts and bolts of psychological first aid, I use this story a lot. Maybe you've heard it before. It's generally attributed to the Cherokee. That might not be really where it came from. People have told me all sorts of things, but here's how it goes. An old Cherokee is teaching his grandson about life. A fight is going on inside of me, he says to the boy. It's a terrible fight, and it's between two wolves. One is evil. He's anger, envy, sorrow, regret, greed, arrogance, self-pity, guilt, resentment, inferiority, lies, false pride, superiority, and ego. And he goes on to say the other wolf is good. He's joy, peace, love, hope, serenity, humility, kindness, benevolence, empathy, generosity, truth, compassion, and so forth. And the same fight is going on inside of you and inside of every other person too. So the grandson thinks about that for a moment, and then he asks his grandfather, which wolf will win? And the old Cherokee says, the one you feed. So I love that story for a couple of reasons. One is that the two wolves really correlate perfectly to the fight or flight versus the rest and digest system. The bad wolf is that sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight, defender distance, selfish and survivalist. And the good wolf is that parasympathetic nervous system, which the vagus nerve, the biggest nerve in your body, is the center of. Rest and digest, tend and befriend, pause and plan. But I put those in quotes, bad and good wolf, because again, your stress response is your ally when you need to rise to the occasion, to seize an opportunity, to take on a challenge, to deal with a threat. So the bad wolf can be, you want him to wake up and give you a hand in those situations. But the other thing the story did for me is made me realize the mistake we make more than any other is we imagine we can just starve the bad wolf. If I just get away from the sources of stress, that's that stress reduction idea, then I'm in renewal. You know, I'll get better. But stress is sticky; it becomes chronic. So when Homer sits on the sofa in his underwear watching the TV mindlessly, he's still in fight or flight. It may not be fight, but it's definitely still flight, and that's still a stress response. So you never have to feed your bad wolf, because bad wolves just go ahead and take whatever they want. But we absolutely have to feed our good wolf. It's not anywhere near as automatic to activate renewal as it is to activate stress. Your stress autopilot will do it whether you want it to or not. And we can train it, but we really need to be intentional about activating renewal. So I want to invite you to a couple of challenges here, if you want. Our brains do stay in that default mode of negativity, negative bias. But resilient people are realistic optimists. So realistic in facing up to reality the way it is, but not losing hope. So a couple of things that help build optimism and positive thinking are these gratitude and generosity challenges. So for 30 days in a row, but not consecutive, because remember, it doesn't have to be consecutive, because you have unlimited permission to fail and begin again. If it takes 30 years, that's fine. Write down 3 things you're grateful for, and these could be little things, 3 things you're looking forward to, and 1 anonymous act of kindness. And again, can be a little thing or a big thing. But with that last one, the key is nobody else can ever know except you that you did that, whether it's picking up trash off somebody's lawn or, if you can fund a college scholarship, great. But you got to do it completely anonymously. Nobody ever gets to know. Trust me, those will be interesting if you do them. It's an interesting way to form habits that are very powerful. So remember, start small, start over. And as our Bay Area Critical Incident Stress Management Team founder, Janet Childs, is always saying, be gentle with yourself, have self-compassion, so important. Unlimited permission to fail and start over, be gentle with yourself. So now we're going to jump right into the nuts and bolts of psychological first aid, although we've really been talking about it the whole time, because again, you can't give away what you don't have. It's been around for a long time. There've been a lot of different protocols. It's very confusing to read the research, but we've been zeroing in recent years on protocols that we know are evidence-informed. You can't test these things because you'd have to intentionally traumatize people, and that's not ethical, so we don't do that. But we're really zeroing in on some things that are generally agreed upon. So critical incident stress management is a name for this bigger picture of doing things like we're doing right now, training people before something happens, preparing in other ways of how are we going to deploy and so forth. A lot of those things you're learning through CERT. Then there's how to support individuals, how to support teams and groups. Referrals are critically important, so I will talk a bit about them. You got to know when something is going on that says, hey, I need to refer this person to a higher level of care. And these things below are those higher levels of care. So we have these more advanced interventions called defusings and debriefings, which we use with teams. So those are teams who are a team before and are going to be a team after going through some critical incident. There's spiritual support, so it's chaplains, pastors, and so forth. People who are specialized in family support. There are psychotherapists who can do more advanced things, and ultimately things like our West Coast post-trauma retreat, which is inpatient on-site care. So psychological first aid fits right here. Does include the training, the pre-incident planning and preparation. It is the only thing we use with individuals, even under, sometimes people think that psychological first aid is something we do as an alternative to critical incident stress management, but it's not. It's part of it. We can use psychological first aid with teams and groups, like families and so forth. And like everybody else at every level here, we need to know when to refer people to a higher level of care. So the goals of psychological first aid, we want to get that monkey mind to calm down. So we want to restore people's sense of safety. We want to get them from that feeling that everything's out of control to the feeling that things are more in control again. So we want to give them a lot of control, all that we can. We want to assist them with their kind of immediate needs that they might have, because social support correlates so deeply to resilience. We want to get them out of isolation and into community. And then as needed, we want to refer them either informally to their own social support network, which maybe they'll need to build it up, or formal support network. And I'll talk about when we need to call 911. So this may sound a little strange, but as you approach this subject, remember that there is no such thing as a traumatic incident. There's only potentially traumatic incidents. So don't assume just because this terrible thing happened that people are truly traumatized. The reality is most people get through these really tough things just fine. It's only a small minority of people that really have long-term difficulties. I know an EMT here in the Bay Area who has done CPR on a lot of babies and never really felt traumatized by it. Most people find that pretty traumatic. I do. But everybody's different. Just because it's traumatic for you doesn't mean it's traumatic for me. When we get brand new, we get these straight teams of firefighters from city fire departments on our big wildland fires who've never been on a forest fire before, and they can have a near miss that's pretty, they have very strong emotional reaction where the experienced wildland firefighters are like, man, that was just a day at the office. So instead of focusing on what happened, pay attention to how people are reacting, including you, right? Because if you're responding to disasters, you're going to be a giver and a receiver of this stuff. So we look at how people are reacting. Sometimes reactions are delayed. Sometimes, they're delayed for days. So we do want to stay in touch with people. But what we don't want to do is go in and say, oh, you need all this help because that was traumatic. Just don't assume it was traumatic unless people are having strong reactions. And most people do recover really, really well. So the big thing is we don't want to interfere with that natural healing. We want to encourage it. So one thing that social support doesn't mean is fixing the problem or fixing the person. Like I said, public safety folks tend to be action-oriented problem-solving people. We just want to fix the problem. And here's how that can go.
This pressure, and sometimes it feels like it's right up on me and I can just feel it, like literally feel it in my head, and it's relentless. And I don't know if it's going to stop. I mean, that's the thing that scares me the most, is that I don't know if it's ever going to stop.
Yeah. Well, you do have a nail in your head.
It is not about the nail.
Are you sure? Because, I'll bet if we got that out of there...
Stop trying to fix it.
No, I'm not trying to fix it. I'm just pointing out that maybe the nail is causing...
You always do this. You always try to fix things when what I really need is for you to just listen.
Yeah, see, I don't think that is what you need. I think what you need is to get the nail out.
See, you're not even listening now.
Okay, fine. I will listen. Fine.
It's just... Sometimes it's like there's this achy... I don't know what it is. And I'm not sleeping very well at all. And all my sweaters are snagged. All of them.
Yeah, That sounds really hard.
It is. Thank you. Ow!
Come on, if you would just
Don't.
Try to see things my way.
So don't be that guy, except for that brief moment when he got it. And he said, that's really hard. So remember, I actually say to people when I meet them to do crisis intervention, I will very often say, I'm not here to fix this or make it better. And that's a reminder to me, as much as it is information for them, that that's not my role. And generally speaking, we can't. When I have done probably over 1,000 crisis interventions, and they vary, the vast majority of them, someone has died. Well, there's no fixing that. There's no making that better. And that's really not why we're there. We're there to create a safe place for people to process those bad feelings, because there's really only one way to get rid of bad feelings. And it's kind of like what Shrek says about farting, better out than in. So the way to get rid of bad feelings is to have them. Your job doing psychological first aid is to create that safe place for people to go ahead and have those bad feelings. So there are some sneaky stressors that I like to warn people about. One is vicarious trauma, vicarious stress. You're empathetic. You would not be sitting through this little webinar if you didn't have a fair bit of empathy for people who are suffering, and you're going to pick some of it up. That's just the way our brains are wired. And you're going to have some of the same reactions, some of the same symptoms and so forth as the people you're working with. So it's very important for you to realize that, notice it, and get your own social support. You should have your own support network and so forth. I couldn't possibly do what I do without my support network of men's groups and my family and professional associates and so forth, and church and so forth. Lots of things play into it. As I said, having that diverse social support is really important. And knowledge plays into it too, but knowledge alone doesn't do it. And then identification is something to watch out for. And the best way for me to explain it is with an example. Imagine a fire crew responding to the drowning of a 10-year-old boy, and one of those firefighters has a 10-year-old boy at home. That firefighter is likely to have a pretty strong reaction because he's going to identify, or she will identify with the parents of the 10-year-old who drowned. Really, any of those firefighters who have children at home, especially if they have a swimming pool, assuming that's how the child drowned. Where this can be sneaky is especially if people resemble you in ways that you tend not to acknowledge. So that's especially in ways that maybe we're not particularly proud of, that person actually is a lot like you, but you're not conscious of that. And then these things can kind of stick with you. And then there are trigger patterns. So sights, smells, sounds, and even calendar dates can bring back the feelings from a traumatic incident. And there's been a lot of talk about triggers in recent years. But it's real. Things do trigger us. I get triggered all the time, especially when I'm doing crisis intervention, because I've had my own things that have happened to me. Plus, I've heard 1,000 stories of just people's worst day of their lives, and I get reminded of those things. And I'll tell you, I usually just kind of take a deep breath, acknowledge it to myself, and I'm able to keep going. But sometimes I have to do a bit more work and processing and so forth. And then I had some pretty big critical incidents myself where I had a rescue where the rescue went bad, and the rescuers actually ended up making a mistake that killed the person we were trying to rescue. A firefighter friend of mine, when I was about 22 years old, was just incinerated in a house fire. That was bad. And then what got me back into public safety and involved in all this was our niece's husband was a U.S. Marine who was killed in the line of duty on November 10th, 2004 in Fallujah. Any of you who are Marines will know the significance of that day. November 10th was that's the Marine Corps birthday, an odd day. Any day would have been a bad day to lose a Marine. And so those dates and things like that, like seeing a widow being handed a folded flag, that's a huge trigger for me. But when I'm triggered, that's a reminder to me that, I have some more work to do on that perhaps. But a lot of times I can simply acknowledge it and I'm okay. So the steps, and we'll go into each of these in a little detail for psychological first aid, is first, just like with everything else we do, insert, and as I talked about before, safety. And then, because your safety is number one. How to make contact, how to make that initial contact, how to see if stabilization that is at a higher level of care than you can give is necessary. Then identifying people's needs and priorities by, talking to them about what's going on for them. And then the psychological part of it is about acknowledging and normalizing how they're reacting to whatever happened, encouraging them to get out of isolation and into that supportive community, because social support makes all the difference. Encouraging them by giving them information, so factual information, where we'll have handouts and so forth we can give them, and then we'll talk about sort of normal recovery, and then when to refer to a higher level of care. So first, safety. And this is a good principle, not just for the people we would consider kind of the victims of a disaster, but for your team as well. If your CERT team is deployed to the scene of a disaster, when they take breaks, it's really good to get them away from a spot where they have to see, hear, or smell that incident, because it's a distraction for one thing, and it's a stress autopilot activator. So if possible, just get away from the scene. If they need practical assistance, if they are in immediate need of shelter, food, or medical care, that comes first. We don't start trying to do that psychological stuff when people have those more immediate needs, and that includes rest and sleep. So emotional safety is critical. Remember, I said we're not there to fix things. We're not there to make things better. We're there to create the safe place for people to go ahead and have those difficult feelings that go with crisis, because that's how we move through it. And so the first step in creating emotional safety is that everything has to remain confidential. If people anybody who's not keeping things confidential in crisis intervention just doesn't get to do crisis intervention, period. Trust is vitally important. The monkey mind is not trusting, it's suspicious, it's distrustful. So it's really easy to break trust and never get it back. So in a disaster, or even a small emergency, a lot of bad information goes around. There's a lot of rumors and so forth. So be super extra careful when doing crisis intervention to ensure that anything you're going to pass on to people has been verified from an official source. Otherwise, just don't. Just say you don't know. If you don't know, you don't know. Because I have had the unfortunate experience of having a police officer who was a little too close to the situation that I was responding to. It was at a school, and it turned out this guy's son was in the classroom that we were working with, where something very bad had happened. He gave me some information that was wrong. He was trying to be nice. He was trying to make it sound like it wasn't what happened. So a teacher died. He said that the teacher died in his sleep comfortably, and that turned out not to be true, and people knew it. And here I am repeating it because I assumed it was true because it came from a police officer. The lesson to me was that if somebody's too close to the situation, don't assume that what they're telling you is accurate. And I had to go back and well, first I had a parent just scream and yell in my face about it, very upset. And then I had to make, very humble apologies to people. It's very hard to get that trust back. So make sure you only share accurate information. And you'll hear people say, it helps to talk. You need, and it does help to talk. But what we should not be saying to one another is, you need to talk about this, or pressuring people to talk. So never, ever, ever, ever push, prod, or pressure someone to talk. And as a way of helping people to support one another, because you're going to leave and they're going to be supporting each other for days, weeks, months, even years afterwards. And so encourage them to give each other this permission to only talk when they want to, with whom they want, about the subjects they want to talk about. And I think when we do that, because people feel safer, they actually become more likely to open up and talk and begin to process through things. But very important to give people that permission and invite them, to urge them to give each other that same permission. So if I'm with a group, I will always give everyone in the group permission not to talk. But then I'll also tell them, by the way, if you name thoughts or feelings, reactions you're having to this that someone else in the group is also having, I want you to know that helps them. So it's not really pressure, but I will let them know, here's a reason you might want to talk, because it really is going to, remember, the monkey mind doesn't like to feel isolated. So those words, me too, are super powerful. And as I said, I very often will say, I'm not here to fix this or make it better. So spiritual safety, remember, that's about priority, mission, value, so forth. So you got to respect theirs. Watch out for the judgment, watch out for the shoulds. We're there to reflect. We're not there to give advice. I was in Haiti after the big earthquake there in 2010. Hundreds of thousands of people were trucked to the countryside and buried in mass graves. And that created an enormous problem in terms of the Haitian people being able to grieve, because they do most of their grieving rituals at the cemetery. And they had no idea where their friends and loved ones were buried. And they were asking me what they should do. I had no idea, and kind of consulted with our team leader. And what we ended up doing is and this is now my go-to phrase, you need to work with your spiritual leaders to figure out how to deal with that, and maybe you'll have to invent something new, but it's not my place. It's really something you as a community need to work out. So accept their beliefs and be kind rather than nice. And here's the difference. When we're nice to people, it's because we're trying to get them to like us. When we're kind to people, we're giving them gifts that they can never repay. So go for the kindness over the niceness. All right, slide advance. There we go. Okay, so making contact. So when you walk up to people, don't just say, how you doing? That people usually just say, I'm fine. In my world, fine is an acronym for fouled up, insecure, neurotic, and emotional, or excitable, pick one. Instead, first get permission. So this is a way you can signal that you're letting them have control. Hey, is it okay if we talk for a few minutes? And if the answer is no, and you let them know, I'm here, to provide support, and it's, let them know it's perfectly okay if they don't want that. Say, I'll be over here if you need anything. Believe me, you just help them by showing that you care. Our team responds out to schools a lot of times, and especially the schools where the people are highly defended. They've been through a lot of trauma in their lives. The school will make an announcement over the PA system that, grief counselors, a phrase I'm not terribly fond of, are available in the library if you want to talk to them, and nobody comes. And when I'm working with somebody who's new to the team, they'll often say, well, why are we here? Nobody's talking to us. And I'll say, we're here so they could make that announcement, because we know from research that making the announcement that somebody cares makes a difference, even if they don't talk to us. So to just be there as a calm symbol of support and care really makes a difference, even if people don't talk to you. So get their names, use their names. Our short-term memory sucks under stress. I have a terrible time remembering people's names, the more stress I'm under, but assure them that it's going to be kept confidential. There are a couple of exceptions to that we will talk about, but assure them that you will keep it confidential. We use a lot of jargon in emergency response. Try not to use it at all. If somebody does use jargon, just interrupt gently and define it so that people are all staying on the same page. And just don't use any cliches at all. Cliches really are about trying to make people feel better, and your job is not to make people feel better. Your job is to create the safe place for really almost the opposite. It's create the safe place for people to go ahead and have permission to feel bad. So here are times that stabilization above and beyond your level of expertise as a provider of psychological first aid is needed. So if somebody is very disoriented, very confused, very frantic, agitated, panicky, if they're very withdrawn, very shut down, if they're super irritable or angry, any of those things, kind of, some of that is natural, typical, and to be expected. But if the word very, put the word very in front of each of these, and in that case, you really need to get, medical, law enforcement, fire, somebody with a higher level of training to work with them rather than trying to work with them yourself. But people are going to be upset and so forth. And I guess I got ahead of myself talking about, being that calm and comforting presence, even if you don't say anything. You can invite people to just take a walk and literally walk beside them, because that's metaphorically, that's what we're always doing. We're just walking beside them. If they are wound up and anxious, you can invite them to use those exercises I talked about earlier. You do want to try and reunite them with family and friends, because social support is so important, but resist the urge to try to take control by ordering them to calm down or anything else. Because remember, the monkey mind, the stress autopilot, wants to feel in control. So everything needs to stay an invitation, and we do need to refer people. And I'll talk about when to refer. So somebody once said the most powerful thing we can bring to a crisis is our curiosity, but there are two kinds. There's curiosity of, geez, I wonder what it's like to be a cop. I wonder what it's like to be a firefighter. And when we get people on our team like that, it's like, nah, that's really not the right motivation for our team to work with those folks. what we want to be curious about is, how was it as a human being to go through that? So Dr. Judd Brewer, who's a psychologist, wrote an article that talks about the 2 kinds of curiosity. It's great. You'll have a link to that on the page here. So we want to identify people's needs and priorities. So you want to quickly figure out if a referral is needed, if they're going to need some other services. Are there things that your team, either CERT team, psychological first aid team, crisis response team, are there things that you're going to want to follow up on? And as you begin to talk to people, you're going to want to think about which of these psychological first aid skills are really going to be helpful for this person or this group. So some questions to ask to now go deeper into what's going on. Again, signal that you're giving them control. Is it okay if I ask you a few questions? So where were you when this happened? Whether it was a fire, flood, tornado, whatever it was, where were you as it happened? That kind of invites them to begin to talk about it. Were you injured? Well, of course, if they say yes, you want to check and make sure they don't need medical. Did you see anybody else get hurt? So seeing other people get hurt can be very, very upsetting, especially if they are friends, relatives, whatever. But just the fact that it may be people in the same neighborhood, remember that identification is going to be going on. They may not know the person who lives in the house across the street, but they're in the house across the street, and there's going to be a lot of identification going on because they live in the same neighborhood. How scary was that for you? That's an invitation to begin talking about it. What else are you worried about? If somebody's missing, or even a pet, that can be huge for people. So ways to invite conversation. So you want to get a sense of their priorities. Remember, we're trying to get them to lead. So what's the most important to you right now? Good way to get things going. Can you tell me more about that? And then these next 2 questions are really powerful. If you don't remember anything else, these 2 questions will serve you really well. I actually will ask myself these questions sometimes, but I use them with other people as well. So what's hardest for you right now? And the right now is very important to that. Remember, the monkey mind is always either generating anxiety from the past or worry about the future. And disasters are overwhelming. They affect every part of people's lives. And so if we ask that second question first, hey, what do you need right now? They're often overwhelmed. They have no idea what they need because their brain's going 72 directions at once. So if you invite them to name what feels the hardest for you right now, they can set aside everything else and just deal with that one piece at a time. It might be a different piece 5 minutes from now, an hour from now, or whatever, but it becomes suddenly way more manageable. And once people can identify what's hardest for them in the moment, they very often can then answer that second question. Okay, what do you need the most right now? And so they might need a glass of water. They might need a meal. They might need a rest. They might need to go for a walk. They might need, I've heard all sorts of things as we go through training. I need to sit in a hot tub surrounded by candles with chocolate and wine. More power to you if you can make it happen. So Elizabeth Weingarten is a psychologist who came up with a bunch of great questions for COVID. They're written for COVID, but you can adapt them to other things just to help support people. And look at this. She wrote 9 questions for taking things further. And these aren't as COVID specific. So you'll have these just as ways to think about how to have a conversation that can be supportive to people. So big job when people are going through crisis is to reassure them. First to acknowledge, especially the emotions behind the words, and then reassure them that they're having a normal and natural reaction. And for the first month or so after a high stress event, any reaction they're having other than wanting to hurt themselves or others, you can reassure them is normal and natural because it is. When these things start going beyond 30 days or so, we begin to worry. But in that first 30 days, and especially, if it's right afterwards, you can just keep reassuring them that, that'll happen. Your brain will do that. That you've been through a really, really abnormal event, and what you're having is a natural reaction. I hear, people tell us that all the time, or you could say, in my training, they said that, that happens to people all the time. So they're going to have physical, they're going to have social, and they're going to have spiritual reactions. So the physical stuff, remember I said stress releases cortisol. Cortisol makes us crave carbohydrates, and it can give us GI digestion issues. So if people are talking about that, you can reassure them, that is a pretty, that'll happen going through this high stress event. Anxiety, headaches, fatigue, low energy, but also high energy, the hyperactivity and adrenaline seeking. It is natural, and you can reassure people that it is natural and normal for them to crave more alcohol or drugs. if they're in recovery, if they've been in recovery, you might say that, hey, maybe this is invite them. Maybe this is a good time to spend a little more time in your support group, whatever that might be. You do want to, caution them and talk to them. Toward the end of your time with them, you want to give them educational information, and that can include the information about alcohol interfering with REM sleep. And remember, I said that adrenaline and cortisol, somebody needs to mute their microphone, they're painkillers. So staying real active and seeking adrenaline could be ways to maintain that level of hiding the pain. Everybody please mute your microphones. And that tired and wired sleep, that is a natural response as well. And you can again acknowledge it and normalize it. So in the social, very often people who've gone through something really high stress, the world feels like they feel like they're living in a movie. Nothing seems quite real. Is this really happening? I felt that way, when the lockdown first happened for COVID. I think I felt that way for 2 or 3 weeks. It's like, holy cow, is this really happening? I had pandemic flu training many times, and I knew that it can be really bad. And when people at the beginning of COVID, I was seeing all the signs that we were headed for something, very much like what happened. But I'd had the training, so I knew what could happen, and yet it still seemed quite unreal to me. And again, you can reassure people that that is a normal reaction to a very abnormal event, or in the case of COVID, a world that just became abnormal overnight. Denial is normal. I'm fine, even though it means fouled up, insecure, neurotic, and emotional. Denial's okay. When something big happens, especially the death of a loved one or someone you're close to, that's huge. Nobody can deal with that all at once. So some denial for a while is perfectly fine. It lets people take one piece at a time. Again, go out 30 days, and if they're in complete denial, maybe that's an issue. But those things are all going to belong in the world with clinicians, not psychological first aid. The stress hormones do make us moody, irritable, angry, frustrated, or withdrawn. And again, you can acknowledge it, normalize it. Distrust and suspicion, that's the monkey mind. Black and white thinking, so it's either this or that, is a stress reaction. And tribalism, it's us versus them. You're either a good guy or you're a bad guy. You meet almost any cop who's been on the job for a few years thinks that way about people. And that's the effect of kind of the chronic stress of doing law enforcement, that there's good guys and bad guys and there's nobody in between. That is stress thinking, as well as possibility thinking. Your brain will be worried about what can happen and what might spend a lot more time on what might go wrong. Okay, I'm looking at Adam. I don't know if you guys can see when I look at the chat, but I think you can. But I'm looking at Adams. When something horrible happens, is it not normal to feel angry, feel like they want to hurt the person? Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So there's a line there. Remember, I said that where in the first 30 days, if they really are considering hurting themselves or someone else, get help, right? And if I'll talk a little bit more about it later. But I think what you said here is absolutely right. Having those feelings is perfectly normal, and it's important to acknowledge them and allow them to have them. But if it rises to the level where they have a plan and resources to carry out that plan, that's when the alarm bells go off, and we need to intervene. And that's probably get law enforcement involved. But I will come back to that. So let's see, memory and concentration difficulties, absolutely. And then the monkey mind knows that we get control from information, and the more information we have, the more control we have. And that's actually the source of a lot of the rumors and conspiracy theories we see around emergencies and disasters and the pandemic. So to explain that a little more, imagine if the difference to the monkey mind between COVID being something random and some nefarious deliberate thing is that if it was deliberate, we could control that in the future, right? So it creates that, the conspiracy theory creates that illusion of something that's controllable, when in truth, it may have just been random. Because boy, the monkey mind doesn't like random stuff because we have no control of that. And then you feel helpless and it's not good. My stamina, I've done this a few times, and I love teaching it. So, but yeah, it is 2 hours of rapid fire information. All right. but we're almost done. So selfish and survivalist. Oh, I'm sorry. I just realized we're going a little over. I will wrap up real quick here, and I appreciate anybody who can stay on. Goodness, I usually don't go that far over. I guess we started later than I thought. Anyway, we can lose our perspective, get that tunnel vision, the hoarding we saw at the beginning of COVID. That's normal. That sense that time speeds up or slows down. I mentioned already moral and ethical changes in struggling with meaning and purpose and so forth. So, so that phrase that I've used a few times, you're having a natural reaction to an abnormal event or world has become abnormal. That's a powerful, and people that we work with all the time get tired of hearing it. So we find other ways to say it. So you could say a lot of people are feeling that way, and reflect the emotions. You sound frustrated, angry, sad, and that's reasonable. Don't say you understand, because you weren't there, you don't understand, but empathy doesn't require understanding. And you can say, that's got to be very difficult, or like the guy in the video said, that's got to be very hard. I wasn't apologizing, but I appreciate you saying that. So we want to get them out of isolation and into community. Social support is so important. We want to plug them into or build up their own social support network. If you're with a group, urge them to share what has helped each other as they go through stress. And because everybody needs their own control and there's no shoulds, everybody's journey is going to be different, and tell them that. So remember that as you do crisis intervention, you're going to be there for an hour or two, and these people are going to be supporting each other down the road. So you need to set a good example, and then tell them, describe what you did, and say, this is how to support one another, because you're each other's best support. And then handouts. So I'm going to give you a couple of sources of handouts. Don't ever start with handouts. That's too impersonal. But at the end is when we want to begin to educate people. So I'm going to give you a Google folder that has my team's handouts in it. We just ask that you don't erase our name and put your name on it as if you created it. That's the one thing we don't like. Otherwise, free to copy all you want. And that NCTS MVA psychological first aid handbook, I'll have a picture of it in a moment, that has some good handouts in it as well. The kind of things that can cover is, what's going to happen next, what services are going to be available responding to this incident, whatever it is, the facts, all those typical stress reactions, all these ways that I talked about to activate renewal and caring for others. So I think this is going to be a few things on normal reactions, and I've talked about some of this already. So the handouts are going to be from either these two sources I give you, or other authoritative sources. So you may find others. So this is the handout we use all the time on my team, and it actually talks about normal reactions to reassure people that they're not going crazy, that other people have responded the same way, and it goes out as much as 3 years. And then when to refer. So if people are getting worse rapidly, absolutely. A lot of us are mandated reporters. We have to report domestic, child, or elder abuse and refer them. If people need medication to be stable, we want to get them to a healthcare provider. If after a month people are really struggling, we want to get them to a clinician or a counselor, somebody, more of a professional. It is normal for children to regress somewhat developmentally in a disaster. But if there's really significant developmental issues, we definitely want to refer them. And anybody who says, I want to refer, please refer them. So here finally is sort of when to call 911. So if they're threatening to hurt themselves or others, there's 3 levels. There's sort of, I'm thinking about it, and I have a plan. And the third level is I'm thinking about it, I have the plan, and I have the resources to carry out that plan. So if all they have is kind of that intention, and here's how you find out. We're usually talking about suicide. And the only way you find out, if you have any inkling that maybe this person is thinking about dying by suicide, you need to ask them straight out, and this is difficult. Are you thinking of killing yourself? And you could say, are you thinking of killing or hurting yourself? But don't say it any other way. And I want to acknowledge that, especially the first time you ever do that, that is a real hard question to ask somebody. But I can tell you, having asked it a number of times, I don't find it so difficult, because now I realize it is such a relief to get the answer, because then I kind of stop worrying. That doesn't mean that the answer isn't always no. I mean, if it's no, I respect that. And I think people, when you ask it directly like that, you remove all the stigma and everything, and I think you'll get an honest answer. If you ask it in some roundabout way, you may not get an honest answer because you're basically sending a signal to them that there is stigma around this. If they say yes, now you can get them the help they need. But what you don't want to do is walk away wondering if you should have asked the question. That's a bad place to be. I have driven to a friend's house. Actually, one of our Gold Star mothers, her son was killed in Iraq. And I got to know her, because I'm part of that club that nobody wants to be part of. And I was at an event with her and she left early. And after she left, I thought, oh my goodness, I wonder how much this upset her. I'm really wondering if she might hurt herself. So I drove to her house, knocked on the door, said, hey, I'm sorry. I just got to ask her, are you thinking of hurting or killing yourself? And she laughed and said, no. She said, I don't know why I'm still here on this earth, but I'm here for some purpose and I'm not going anywhere. And thanks for asking. That was a moment for sure. So I know about cahoots. I met some of the cahoots people up in Oregon when I was on an assignment up there recently. It's a great example of how to do things, but we don't have time to go into it. Intention only, make an appointment, doesn't have to be right away. Intention and a plan, get them an immediate appointment if they have the intention, the plan, and the resources to carry it out. Don't leave them. In each of these cases, try to get them to refer themselves to help. If they will not do it, think of it this way. They're no longer being responsible with their own life. They handed that responsibility off to you. You need to dial 911, get them the help they need, and take that responsibility. There's great suicide training out there. I just took probably the 4th suicide intervention class I've ever had through Team Rubicon. They use a program out of Canada called Assist. That's pretty good. And there are some other good ones like QPR and others. So the book, we are wrapping up here. In fact, I will turn on my video. So there is the book that goes with this class, and that's not it. That's Stress and the Strength. Here it is. So it does cover, it's based on this webinar, but it goes into more depth on the topics there. And oops, what did I do? Oh, I clicked the link. So I said I would recommend more training. So this 2-hour giant brain dump is not enough to really be able to do psychological first aid well. NCTSN and Dr. George Everly, who's one of my instructors and a founder of the ICISF, the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation, these 2 classes are pretty complementary. And they're a great way to do follow-on training that is online. That's what the field manual looks like. It has great handouts in it and so forth. For that first one, you'll have the link to our handouts, but again, just don't change the attribution. Here's a bunch of ways to get a hold of me. And always remember, please feed your good wolf. There's the books. You'll have a link to the books. And that's it. So again, apologize for going a little long and sorry for anybody who had to leave. Yeah, so sounds a lot like 12-step program. Well, yeah, 12-step program, that's social support, it's acknowledgement, it's normalizing. It is a lot of these things. So let me stop sharing, and I'm happy to stick around for a little while if you have questions, comments. And I will say, I do these for free because people do end up buying the books, and I'm super grateful to anybody who buys the books, and I'm super grateful to anybody who's kind enough to write a review of my books, because those reviews make a giant difference. So I learned working with a big publisher like HarperCollins, and we can't see that because there we go. They actually wait until there's about 50 reviews of a book before they will really heavily promote it. So I have about 23 reviews on Goodreads and about 10 on Amazon. So we're getting there. But if you can write reviews on Amazon or Goodreads, I really appreciate that. And thank you for what you're doing in the community. CERT is a wonderful program. And I think it's just great when people in CERT are interested in this topic.
Thank you, Nick. This was an amazing presentation. We had most of the 115 people stay on until the end. We did have a few people drop off, and a few people are dropping off now, but we still have over 102 people. So can I get a round of applause for Nick?
So Douglas Parkinson, I see your note there, and welcome home. My draft lottery number for that war was 4. Luckily, the draft had ended.
Oh, and to answer your question, we could see that there was a chat box up, but we couldn't read what was in the chat.
Oh, good. Okay. I wasn't sure if people could see that.
Looks like John has his hand up. John, you want to unmute and ask a question?
Yeah, let me answer Margarita's question real quick here. There is a version of this webinar on my YouTube page. And I have a more recent one that I'm going to edit and put up there too.
Let me answer the question about the email. So when you registered for Zoom, it also took your email address. So I know who was attending. And unless you have an issue with it, I'm going to go ahead and send the roster from the class who actually attended to Nick. If you do have an issue with it, please let me know in chat or email me, and I will remove you from that roster. And then Nick, did you say something about a certificate of completion?
Yeah, when I do this webinar, I also issue a certificate of participation. So it basically says, 2 hours of training on psychological first aid. So I'll be able to include that as well.
And someone's asking about the YouTube. I'm putting the YouTube link here. This is recorded and streamed right now on YouTube. And so if you want to rewatch it, it should be available very shortly.
Oh, you'll keep it up on your YouTube channel?
Yes.
Great. Okay, I'll probably send people your way because this is gonna be a lot more recent than the one I have on my channel. That's great.
Mary, you have your hand up.
Yes. Would you mind putting your contact information in the chat, please?
Sure. It will be on the slides, but here's my email address. And I'm happy to take emails.
All right. Any other questions?
Well, and to everybody who said thank you, you're absolutely welcome. Very happy to do it.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
Welcome.
Thank you so much.
One question, where do we get your book?
Oh, it's on Amazon.
It's on
All of my
Amazon,
books are on
okay.
Amazon. So if you search under my name, Nick Arnett, on Amazon, I think probably my author page will show up and the books.
Good, thank you.
Thank you.
Is there a part 2?
I don't have a part 2 for this myself yet. I'm not sure what Patrick might come up with for LA Cert, but I will mention, and I will type into here. Let's see. Let me get the address up. There is some wonderful free training for crisis intervention from Crisis Response Care. If you're familiar with K-Love Radio, they take some of their donations for their radio network and fund crisisresponse.org. And they hire some of the very best instructors in the world. It's actually how I've done some of my training. And they put on these classes around the country, and they have resumed their in-person classes. They were, like everybody else, they were on Zoom for a while. So crisisresponse.org is a great, and I know they periodically come down to the LA area, or those of you who are in other places, they are in, they travel around putting on really, really good classes. And they make those available first to first responders. So it can be a little difficult to get into classes sometimes, but they do open them up to everybody.
There's a question about how to get the slides. Like I said, I'm going to give Nick the list of the people who attended, and then he'll send out the slides as well as a certificate of participation.
You're going to send it to everybody that attended the certificate of completion?
Yep. Yeah, we'll do that.
Thank you so much. It was great. What a great class. I'm a nurse, and we use a lot of this stuff in our my practice. So
yep. Yeah, nurses, more and more groups of nurses are creating peer support teams using this and other. On our Bay Area CISM team, we have nurses from a couple of the trauma centers, and we've helped them build up their peer support. Definitely needed.
we on mission, we always have to ask that question if they're suicidal, like exactly what you talked about.
Yep. Yeah, there's no other way to ask it.
Yeah, that's one thing in the EMT class, they tell you about having asked that question, but they don't go over how to ask it. And you're saying literally ask it straightforward, but it's there's got to be more to it than that. And I think unless you actually done it a few times, it's getting over that hang up on how to ask the question.
Having just taken a class, which actually it's a 2-day class, and they had the students practice asking each other, and I was sitting there kind of amazed, and remembering though that before I had spent 18 years doing this kind of thing, for me to ask even in a classroom to ask that question, look somebody in the eye and ask that question is pretty difficult. Let's see. A follow-up specifically for structural and wildland firefighters would be super helpful. Well, Adam, I would love to do that. And I do that actually. I'll be training our park rangers who are also wildland firefighters here in Santa Clara County. Shortly, I do that once a year for them. And I have worked for CAL FIRE's Employee Support Services. I'm on the U.S. Forest Service Critical Incident Stress Management team. It is hard sometimes to come up with the budget for that. But that is where a lot of my passion is, for sure. And I do a ton of this informally at work, because I spend, the last few years I've spent from June through November away from home, the majority of the time out on wildland fires.
There was a question, Ron, you have about how CERT and Ryland interact. CERT and Ryland are two separate programs, but what we've done as CERT coordinators is we've created the neighborhood team program in an attempt to take the CERT training down to the block level. And we've partnered with LA City Emergency Management Department, which their program is called Ryland, Ready Your Los Angeles Neighborhood. And it's based on the Map Your Neighborhood program. And so we partner with them, bring them in, and have them teach that block level part of it using Ryland. And so what we're trying to do with Neighborhood Team Program is to create neighborhood disaster response teams that will be able to activate. These teams will be made up of both CERT and non-CERT people, and they'll be able to respond immediately after a disaster without being told to activate. We expect that the fire department's not going to be calling anybody and saying, hey, we need CERT. It's going to be something that you're going to have to understand on your own, that everything just hit the fan. And now it's time to find out how bad it is and help our neighbors out, because the fire department's busy and 911 is not going to get to them as soon as they would like to. So that's how it interacts. It's not a formal relationship, but we're using Ryland and CERT together. Michael, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, this question is for Nick. Nick, how are the live training structured for physical, psychological first aid? Is it much like what you would see at a wilderness first aid, where it's scenario based and where
there's a lot of role playing, because things like asking that question, are you thinking of hurting or killing yourself, is something that people do need to practice. So we do, it's lots of scenarios and role playing, along with the more didactic instruction.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Then again, Nick, thank you so much. This was an amazing presentation. You did go over, but I don't think too many people took offense to that. I'll send out a survey, see how many people, mark us down for going over by, 10 minutes, but we'll always get those people.
I'm curious.
But I think the vast majority of the people stayed on because of the great presentation that you gave. So thank you so much.
I enjoyed it. I always enjoy doing it, and I really appreciate everybody who volunteers for CERT.
All right. Have a good night, everyone.
Good night.
And Nick will be reaching out to you in a little bit, or probably a couple days from now.
Thank you so much, Patrick and Nick. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.